A single strike on the world's largest gas field sent shockwaves from Tehran to Wall Street, starting a chain reaction that could change the balance of power in the world. Energy, law, and war all came together in the Persian Gulf, and the effects are just starting to show. The South Pars gas field, which is a huge network of wells and pipelines under the Persian Gulf, has long been thought to be a key part of the region's energy infrastructure. It crossed the sea border between Iran and Qatar and made up a large part of both countries' natural gas exports. It sent large amounts of gas to global energy markets, which helped the economies of the region and long-term contracts with Asia and Europe. Israel's airstrike on the Iranian part of the field was very precise, but the effects went far beyond the area where the blast happened. Pipelines broke, compression stations stopped working, and processing plants stopped making noise. The immediate effect was a real disruption of supply, but the bigger effect was psychological. Tehran's critical infrastructure was suddenly vulnerable, and energy markets around the world noticed that hundreds of millions of cubic feet of gas were no longer available every day. The pictures that came out in the hours after the strike told a story of emptiness and silence. Satellite images showed damaged rigs and burned buildings, which was a big change from how busy the complex usually is. Operations in Iran came to a halt. Technicians rushed to figure out how bad the damage was, but because of the fire, the building's structural damage, and the broken control systems, they couldn't quickly restart production. The Energy Ministry's messages made it clear that recovery would take weeks instead of days, which meant that output would be limited for a long time. The strike not only caused an immediate logistical crisis, but it also revealed a systemic weakness. Iran's vital energy infrastructure, which is a key part of its economic and geopolitical power, could be put at risk in a single operation, even without a full-scale invasion. U.S. statements right after the strike made its geopolitical impact even stronger. President Trump's statement that the U.S. had no idea about the attack served a number of purposes. On one level, it tried to keep up the appearance of neutrality, keeping Washington out of the direct act of aggression while also making it clear that Tehran's retaliation would have serious consequences. On another level, it sent a message that Iran couldn't see U.S. distance as a sign of weakness. The public framing also made the complicated relationships between allies in the area clearer. Qatar, a close U.S. ally that shares the South Pars field, was clearly not to blame. Israel's role, on the other hand, was widely reported but not confirmed or denied. This carefully chosen language showed how hard it is to balance showing strength, keeping allies in line, and avoiding a direct U.S.-Iran conflict right away. There was a clear strategic ultimatum in the president's speech. The message was clear. If Iran attacked Qatar's facilities, Qatar would respond with a strike of unprecedented scale against the resource that had been attacked. This explanation of conditional force added a new kind of risk to the conflict's calculations. Iran was already weighing the costs of its response when it had to choose between defending its sovereignty and stopping further encroachments and avoiding a response that could lead to a huge U.S.-led counterstrike. The ultimatum changed the way things worked, turning energy infrastructure into both a target and a bargaining chip in a bigger strategic standoff. Analysts in the capitals of the region said that this clear link between the risk of retaliation and important resources created a pressure point that could affect the decisions made at the highest levels of Tehran's political and military hierarchy. The market reacted quickly and strongly right away. As traders thought about what a broken South Pars supply chain would mean, oil futures shot up. Energy indices showed more volatility, and investors were looking for ways to protect themselves from the uncertainty that is now present in the Persian Gulf. LNG contracts, which were already limited by seasonal demand, were especially affected by the news because Qatar's share of production could be stopped. The shock sent waves through global commodities markets, which made people rethink how much they were willing to pay for energy security. For many, what had seemed like a far-off geopolitical flashpoint turned into a real threat to supply reliability, showing how one tactical strike could lead to strategic instability. The world went from a fragile balance to a full-blown crisis in just a few hours. with the South Pars strike acting as both a physical and mental trigger for a larger geopolitical conflict. The immediate diplomatic fallout from the South Pars strike showed that the global order was full of cracks. It showed how weak the systems of trust and legal accountability had become in a world that is so connected. World capitals responded with a mix of fear and careful planning. Washington's insistence on staying out of the conflict, along with its clear threat of using force if Iran attacks Qatar, made it seem like the U.S. was sending mixed signals about its policy. Allies, especially in Europe and the Gulf, had to deal with this uncertainty. They had to balance public statements of concern with private talks about how to align with U.S. defense commitments and keep the region stable. Enemies like Moscow and Beijing took advantage of the situation to question the legitimacy of unilateral force, saying it showed that the West was becoming less restrained in its approach to intervention. The legal issues that came up right away after the strike were hard to figure out. International law, codified in treaties and conventions regulating the use of force and the inviolability of civilian infrastructure, seemed to have been challenged. The principles of sovereignty and proportionality were at the heart of the debate. Was it okay to attack shared energy infrastructure as a preemptive measure, or did it violate Iran's territorial integrity? Energy facilities, although dual use in certain situations, are predominantly safeguarded by international law, owing to their essential function in civilian welfare and economic stability. Experts in legal forums pointed out that Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter is not very clear and that the rules about necessity and self-defense are not very clear either. They also said that the South Pars operation was on the line between military precision and possible illegality. Iran's political response was both open and planned. Officials said the strike was an open act of destabilization planned by outside forces, framing it as a coordinated attack on Tehran's sovereignty. Iran stressed the attack's illegitimacy in statements to regional partners and called for recognition of the larger pattern of encroachment in the Gulf. The language was not only defensive, but it also tried to create a story of victimization that would make retaliatory actions seem reasonable to both domestic and regional audiences. Tehran's dealings with Turkey, Egypt, and Pakistan were part of a planned effort to build a coalition of concerned countries that would work together to keep an eye on what it called rising threats from U.S.-aligned actors. Doha's response showed how fragile shared infrastructure can be in conflict zones. The Qatari government called the attack on South Pars dangerous and irresponsible, which made it clear that it was also a threat to its own LNG facilities. The formal diplomatic response was the expulsion of 2 high-ranking Iranian diplomats. This showed that Qatar saw the incident as more than just a disagreement with Iran. It saw it as a threat to its national security. This action showed how regional energy interdependence works. A strike on one part of a shared resource automatically involved several sovereign states in the legal and political fallout, making it harder to negotiate and deal with crises diplomatically. Behind the public statements and official protests, international capitals were having complicated talks about the legal and political effects. Legal advisors and strategic ministries looked at what happened in the attack and thought about what would happen if they supported, condemned, or stayed neutral in the face of one-sided attacks on shared infrastructure. The discussions included evaluations of mutual defense commitments under security agreements, the understanding of proportionality in response, and the danger of establishing lasting standards that could legitimize analogous actions by other nations. These important talks took place behind closed doors, away from the public eye, in rooms where power, law, and regional stability all came together. They set the stage for the next step in the escalation. Iran's reaction to the South Pars strike showed that things were getting worse and moving from words to actions. The Iranian military announced a new stage of conflict within hours and made it clear that energy facilities across the Gulf were fair game for retaliation. This declaration was more than just a show of power. It gave legal and strategic reasons for actions that would have direct effects on neighboring countries and international energy markets. The military leaders made it clear that any future attacks would be met with harsher punishment. This showed that they wanted to use kinetic capabilities not only to punish those they thought were aggressors, but also to change the way diplomats think in Doha, Riyadh, and Abu Dhabi. The operational messaging made it clear that Iran was taking two approaches, showing strength while also discouraging further attacks. The tactical execution of this escalation was quick and had many levels. Missile batteries and drone fleets were sent to attack energy facilities in Qatar and Saudi Arabia that were connected to U.S. and allied interests, such as the Ras Laffan complex in Qatar and processing plants in Saudi Arabia. The strikes were very accurate and hit key infrastructure that affects the amount of exports and the flow of energy in the region. Tehran planned these operations so that they could deny any civilian deaths while causing the most damage to industrial and logistical networks. At the same time, reports say that cyber reconnaissance and electronic warfare were used to check the readiness of regional air defenses and make it easier for follow-up attacks to happen. The end result was that the battlefield grew beyond Iran's borders, making it clear to everyone in the region that energy infrastructure was now a contested area in the larger conflict. Washington's institutional response showed how important this situation was. Senior defense officials quickly talked to NATO partners, Gulf Cooperation Council states, and regional U.S. commands to figure out how fast things were moving and what risks might be involved. There were talks about asking for more money for the military, making plans for long-term operations, and putting strategic assets in the Gulf ahead of time. Analysts pointed out that the lack of a set end date for U.S. operations highlighted the strategic framing. The campaign would go on until key goals were met, such as neutralizing Iran's missile, drone, and energy targeting capabilities. The connection between policy, operational planning, and budgetary allocations showed how the institution was trying to keep pressure on while keeping escalation within reasonable limits. As Iranian attacks got worse, regional defense systems worked very well to stop them. To protect important energy nodes and civilian populations, advanced air defense networks like Patriot missile batteries and radar-guided interceptors were turned on. We tracked, intercepted, and neutralized waves of missiles and drones coming in. This made the Gulf a kinetic zone where it was both a testing ground and a defensive barrier. The engagement showed how weak and strong regional systems are. Some targets were damaged, but many attacks were stopped, showing how complicated it is to integrate modern energy and defense systems. This constant state of operational tension was caused by the constant interaction between offensive operations and defensive readiness. Every action had an immediate and visible effect. Multinational organizations had to go into emergency mode outside of the battlefield. The United Nations Security Council held emergency meetings to talk about the situation getting worse. At the same time, regional energy agencies looked into how it would affect the reliability of supply, LNG exports, and contractual obligations. There were coordinated briefings to look at possible effects on people, the law, and the need for mediation or enforcement of sanctions. International financial regulators kept an eye on the commodity and futures markets because they thought that any disruption in gas and oil flows could have a big impact. The combination of military, diplomatic, and institutional activity showed that the conflict was no longer limited to one country. It had become a multi-layered geopolitical and economic crisis, which would have big effects on the market and the structure of things. The increase in military operations in the Gulf quickly put real pressure on global energy markets, revealing structural weaknesses that had been hidden by relative stability for a long time. Within hours of the South Pars strike and Iran's response, benchmark oil prices shot up to levels not seen in years. Traders were worried not only about the immediate drop in output, but also about the uncertainty surrounding access to one of the world's most important energy corridors. Strategic petroleum reserves, which have long been thought of as a way to protect against geopolitical shocks, were suddenly being looked at closely as countries tried to figure out if their current stockpiles would be enough to keep their markets stable. The ripple effect happened right away. Rising energy costs started to affect the transportation, manufacturing, and utility sectors, which caused inflationary pressures in both developed and emerging economies. Liquefied natural gas, which is becoming more and more important for heating homes and businesses in the winter, was severely affected. The Ras Laffan facility in Qatar, which is one of the largest LNG hubs in the world, had to shut down for safety reasons and because of missile damage. The result was that LNG supplies were limited for economies in Europe and Asia that depend on energy, where reliance on Gulf exports had grown over the past 10 years. Buyers started looking for other sources, chartering ships for longer routes or using force majeure clauses, which changed contract negotiations and delivery schedules in real time. The global energy network is so interconnected that problems in one area can cause supply imbalances all over the world. This showed how fragile what had been thought to be a strong export infrastructure was. The increased risk in the Persian Gulf had an immediate effect on the maritime and insurance industries. The Strait of Hormuz, a key choke point for a large part of the world's oil exports, became the center of attention for security assessments. Insurance premiums for tankers went up a lot as underwriters recalculated the chances of damage or seizure. This was because of how powerful Iranian missiles are and how disputed the waters in the region are. Shipping routes were looked at again, and some operators thought about taking longer detours to avoid exposure. Ports and logistics hubs in the area worked with both military and commercial groups to control the flow of ships. However, the possibility of bottlenecks added an extra layer of systemic risk, showing how military escalation can affect global trade networks. The financial markets reacted quickly and in a very unstable way. The US dollar rose against regional currencies as investors moved their money to what they thought were safe havens. This was similar to how oil and gas flows were uncertain. Equity markets, especially in countries that export energy, showed a geopolitical risk premium, with indices moving sharply during the day as investors thought about what would happen if the conflict continued. Central banks and policymakers kept a close eye on the situation, knowing that rising prices caused by energy shortages could force them to change interest rates or fiscal policy more quickly. The instability of commodities, currencies, and equities showed how global financial systems are linked and how a conflict in a local energy hub can quickly cause economic problems around the world. Supply chains that went from Asia to Europe had a series of problems that showed how energy insecurity can have structural effects. Manufacturing hubs that needed natural gas to keep running had to change how they worked or put off making things. Shipping costs and fuel availability changed, which made things even worse for logistics networks that were already having trouble because of problems from the pandemic. Energy is both a key input and a lever of influence in a system that affects all end-use sectors, from chemicals to fertilizers. The situation changed the way people thought about energy security, turning it from a purely tactical issue into a structural weakness with global leverage points. A problem in one node could cause instability in many sectors and areas. These market distortions showed that the South Pars conflict was not just a regional crisis, but also a test of how well the system can handle stress, which will lead to long-term changes in geopolitics. The South Pars crisis revealed a persistent structural weakness at the heart of global energy networks. States that depended on energy from other countries had to rethink their national energy plans, putting resilience and diversification ahead of short-term economic efficiency. Infrastructure security became an important part of national policy. To lessen the power of concentrated choke points, governments sped up spending on alternative supply chains, strategic reserves, and domestic energy production. The psychological effect of the strike made people think that energy facilities, which were once thought of as neutral economic assets, are now possible strategic flashpoints that could cause problems in the region or even around the world. Energy independence became a key part of national security for policymakers, changing strategic doctrines for many years to come. The war also changed the alliances in the region, making countries rethink both old alliances and new ones. Some traditional partnerships fell apart because they couldn't count on each other when things went wrong with shared infrastructure. Others tried to strengthen their ties by working together on security projects, sharing intelligence, and coordinating their defense plans to protect themselves from threats that weren't equal. Tehran took advantage of these changes to gain power over friendly countries and show weaknesses in enemy countries, turning a localized energy conflict into a more strategic way to negotiate. This led to a change in the geopolitics of the region, where trust, coercion, and necessity shaped new alliances and counterbalances. Multilateral institutions, which have long been seen as arbiters of global norms, came under more scrutiny when their ability to mediate or enforce compliance was put to the test. Organizations like OPEC and the United Nations had to deal with conflicting claims of sovereignty, different legal interpretations of proportionality, and disagreements over who had the power to enforce the laws. The crisis showed that these groups can't always stop things from getting worse, but they might be able to help with stabilizing things after a conflict. The South Pars incident served as a case study for international governance, illustrating the difficulties of harmonizing global energy interdependence with the disjointed authority characteristic of contemporary statecraft. It highlighted the need for adaptable frameworks that can handle both quick military escalation and the long-term stability of important economic systems. After the initial shocks, financial markets started to include the South Pars conflict in their long-term risk calculations. Energy pricing models now always included a geopolitical premium to show how fragile important infrastructure is and how unpredictable military escalation is. Investment strategies changed, and portfolios started to have more assets that were resilient, alternative energy sources, and exposure to a wider range of supplies. Insurance markets around the world changed their coverage and premiums to take into account the risk of infrastructure damage caused by conflict. This added the cost of possible disruption to both commercial and sovereign calculations. In this setting, market participants came to understand that geopolitical instability is not a temporary danger, but a fundamental aspect of 21st century economic systems. In the end, the South Pars conflict became a turning point in modern geopolitics, showing how fragile the balance is between energy, law, and power. Its effects went beyond just destruction. They changed how people thought about strategy, how alliances were formed, how institutions were trusted, and how markets worked. The crisis made governments, businesses, and investors face the fact that critical infrastructure is always at risk and that regional conflicts have effects that affect everyone. These changes at the system level will set the rules for international cooperation, energy security planning, and conflict resolution for the next 10 years. As Ultimora 24 has shown, the effects of this event are a warning that energy, which used to be just an economic resource, is now at the center of a complicated geopolitical system where law, force, and market power come together in ways that are both permanent and hard to predict. What strategies can states use to lessen their dependence on weak energy choke points? How might regional alliances change if threats to infrastructure continue? Could global governance systems change to make sure that people are held accountable when there are conflicts over important resources? The South Pars crisis is far from over, and everyone is watching every move in this high-stakes game of power and energy. What do you think? Will the global markets be able to handle this new time of energy instability, or are we in for a decade of constant crisis? Leave a comment with your thoughts, share this information, and subscribe to Ultimora 24 to stay ahead of the next big political event.